So, good afternoon and welcome to our moderated conversation. This afternoon, you are tuning into This is America, a series of conversations about racial slavery, its legacy, and anti Black racism. Today, we will be in conversation, or I will be in conversation, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions on the topic of memorializing Black Death. We will, and I just as a reminder, um, excuse me, as a reminder, there are two other conversations in this series. One will take place next Tuesday on design practices and memorializing difficult histories. And the third conversation will be on April 20th with a group of 4 Black monument builders. So today I am really pleased to introduce 3 monument builders and sculptors who are going to give 15-minute presentations each, and then we'll have a conversation with them. So today, and I will introduce them all now, as I think that's the easiest way to make this work. I will start by introducing David S. Newton, who is the sculptor and designer of the Freedmen's Memorial Cemetery in Dallas, Texas. David is the figure sculpture and drawing assistant professor at Fontbonne University in Clayton, Missouri, and since 1995, the owner of David Newton Studio. He is a classically trained sculptor in the European academic tradition. Today, Newton will discuss his design and sculptures for the Freedman Cemetery Memorial. The second speaker will be Mario Chidio. Based in Napa, California, Mario has been a professional sculptor for 35 years, engaging in a range of public commissions. He has been deeply influenced by Michelangelo's Pietà and the Four Slaves, works that impressed upon him dynamic gesture and the depths of emotion possible in sculpture. Chidio will focus his presentation on the Paths of Thorns and Rose, a monumental sculpture that is part of the Contrabands and Freedmen Cemetery Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia. Our third speaker will be Jerome Meadows. Since 1997, Jerome has served as the director of Meadowlark Studio and Indigo Sky Community Gallery in Savannah, Georgia. The studio functions as a design build service catering to small-scale personal works as well as large outdoor commissions. This afternoon, Jerome will address his work for the African Burying Ground Memorial in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, entitled We Stand in Honor of Those Forgotten. So we will start with David and proceed through the rest of the day. So let me stop sharing my screen. And David, you are on.
Yes. Okay. Yes, my name is David Newton. I'm a sculptor born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I went to college for creative studies in Detroit and also the New York Academy of Art in New York City. And soon after graduating in 1993, the commission for Freedman Cemetery Memorial came up. I started competing for that in 1995 and received it at that time. And it took about 8 years to complete the whole project, but that was my first major commission. So now I'm going to go over this with you and point by point, and we can see what, okay. There's a little delay on these. Okay, I'm having a little problem. I'm going to see if this is going to, I apologize, my slide is not working right now. Okay, there is a quite a delay in it. Well, I'm just going to go on with this. And as you saw on the first slide, there was an arch, and that arch came from me traveling to Europe. I actually took classes in Florence, Academy of Art in Florence, Italy. there I got acquainted with architecture from Europe at the time, and a lot of arches with platforms for many sculptures. So I kind of, when the job for Freedman's Memorial came up, that was an important part of my original thought process for it. So I wanted an entry arch at the time, and I wanted the front and the back of the arch to kind of show the different elements. My primary theme for the project was telling the whole African-American genesis, from freedom in Africa to enslavement, and then to emancipation here in the United States. And then I wanted to deal with the future by dealing with poetry from children. Rather than sculpting a young person, I wanted to actually show poetry and how children actually got involved with the project. As you saw on the front of the arch, I had two figures, a male and a female figure, an African warrior. And his site, since the site had been desecrated, his job was to protect that site from any further desecration. And he was dressed in the regalia of a warrior from the tribe of Benin in Africa that was also famous for their bronze sculptures. The female figure is called the prophetess, and she's holding a harp, and that's a way to show she is a communicator or a poet, and she is inviting people into the site to actually see the history of the people that are buried there. As we go to the back of the arch, right now the slide that is up is I call the struggling soul. And this shows that Africans did not agree to slavery. It was something that had to be enforced by violence, and that they never gave up struggling against it. So he is struggling against his chains. You can also see that he has a watery background that shows that he came over a large body of water to get to his site. Okay, it's moving now.
There we go.
Okay, can everyone see it moving?
Yeah.
I really apologize for that.
There we go. Wonderful. It's working now. Thank you, David.
So I'm going to go through these images really fast, and because we've talked about some of them. Again, here we see the arch. On the back, we go from freedom in Africa with two figures that are sculpted in the round, and I use the actual sculpting them in the round as a symbol that they are free. On the back of the arch, we have the enslaved Africans. So they've traveled from freedom in Africa to enslavement. And on the back, you see I have a male and a female figure representing slavery, because the experience of the men and women were different. They had different things they had to deal with as enslaved people. So I wanted to show the difference that both men and women had to deal with. Again, we have the warrior here from the Benin culture, the prophetess who is in a pose of inviting you into the site with her hand. And the lyre is a symbol of an orator or a poet in ancient symbolism. Here we have the female figure. I call this violated soul, because women had a whole different experience with enslavement than males did. So I'm kind of showing her more in a fetal position. You also see that her face is covered. The male struggling soul's face is covered. That's a symbol that the identity of the individual slave does not matter at all in that society that has slavery. Your individuality is not, you are a non-person by the standards of those societies. Again, the male figure who's struggling against his chains, see his face is also covered. This is a symbol that the identity, personal identity, is not important. You also see that these are in high relief, not figures in the round. And that is a symbol that when you look at these figures, they look complete and whole from the front. But as you see them from a relative three-quarter view, you see they are in relief, high relief, but you see that they are not complete people in the round. So that was a symbol on the show of their personhood had been taken from them in many ways. On the top of the arch, I have niches, and these niches represent Africa and how the African culture communicated with their ancestors. Many of the people in this site, they would have had Christian burials, but when they were taken from Africa, there were African burial traditions that came along with them that were actually used at Freedman's Memorial by the people that were buried there and their families. Here I have a figure that is offering a seashell. A lot of the burials had seashells and broken pottery on them, and this was a ritual that came from Africa and that was used at the Freedman site. So I wanted to incorporate that. And I got this information from a lot of the archaeologists that were there that I got to speak to before I started designing the project, and they made me aware of these burial practices. I have a figure with a drum, and that is a way of communicating with your ancestors, your dead ancestors. So I wanted to show the communication was still going on. This is at the African American Museum in Dallas, Texas. This is a recreation of one of the burials that were originally at the site. And you can see that there are seashells on it and broken pottery. And the African American Museum in Dallas has a permanent exhibition about the Freedmen's Town and the Freedmen's Memorial. If you're ever in Dallas, it would be a good place to go. Now, this is an aerial view. Since there were only 2 headstones that were found at this site, and they were rededicating the whole site as a cemetery, I wanted to have a symbolic headstone that was like a community headstone that kind of represented all the people that were buried there. Along with the niche that showed the religion of Africa, I wanted something to show the religion that many of the people would have been buried or would have been practicing at the time. So from a view from above, you can see it's the symbol of a cross. And right in the middle of the cross, there you have the emancipated African figures. In the niche, I also have 2 figures between the African style figures. Both of these are warriors. The male is a warrior, African warrior, and the woman is an African warrior. And that's to show that they were enslaved in Africa first before they were taken to the Americas, right? And that there was fighting by Africans against slavery in Africa itself. So they wouldn't even be taken. So I wanted a symbol of that. So here we have an African warrior. This warrior to me represents more of sub-Saharan Africa. And the female figure, you see a sword at her feet, and she is leaning on someone that she has used that on to defend herself from being taken as a slave. But she also represents North Africa. On the ball, on the top of the arch, on the front, this will be the front, where the 2 free African warrior and prophetess are, you can see that the continent of Africa is sculpted on the front of the ball. That is a way of saying African or from Africa. And on the back of the ball, I don't have a clear of that, there's a sculpture of the United States. So that's my way of saying African American in a symbolic way. You also see here that as you go to the central figure, the ground, the whole project is kind of sloping down into the ground. That's my symbol of you're kind of now going into the land of the dead or people that have been buried. So that's a little below ground. You also see benches there because I wanted it to be a living monument also where people could come and gather and have events also. So I kind of designed seating into the overall design. Now this figure is called Dream of Freedom, and this represents the emancipated Africans after emancipation. That would have been a time of great joy, of course, but to many of them, they wouldn't know what freedom is, right? What do we do now? Where do we go now? They also might have been mourning some of their ancestors that wanted freedom and never saw it, right? So I have them kind of thinking about it, meditating on it, consoling each other. and thinking about what is our future going to be now in this country. So that's what they kind of represent. I want them to represent. Also on their backs, both the man and the woman have the marks of slavery on their bodies. The scars from being abused and tortured by whipping. But it also, the symbolism is more than just the abuse. When you have scars, that means you survived, right? Only people that survived have scars. So I wanted to show that they survived that slavery. They survived that hardship. And they went on to have families and go on to achieve things as much as possible in this country. But that abuse did not destroy them or kill them. They learned to heal those wounds and go on with their lives. Now, there are only 2 headstones that remained at the site, and I incorporated them into the design. One was of a baby boy, and the other one was of an older person, but these were the only 2 headstones that remained at the site. When they first desecrated the site, they had first ran railroad tracks through it, then an expressway. They threw away a lot of the headstones. They were used for landfill. They also did that with the bodies. So these are the last 2 remaining headstones out of 5,000. They're estimated there were 5,000 burials at Freedmen's Memorial, and these are only 2 headstones left. I also have this figure with river stones in it. I wanted this to be like, this delineates the whole Freedmen's Memorial from the actual active burial ground. So I wanted a specific element that separated the memorial from where people are actually buried. So I did this symbolic river, like the River Jordan that has river stones at the bottom of it. And when you cross from one area to the other, you're like crossing from the land of the living to the land of the dead. You can also see I have poems on all plaques on all the columns, and those represents poems because I wanted a combination of words and images on the same project. As you see here, this area is a giant big slab of granite in which the poem called Here is the main poem of the site is incised on that granite. As part of my original project, my mother is a professional poet. She was also a teacher. So I wanted to, from that legacy, I wanted to incorporate words and images and words, the sculpture and words. So I worked with a local poet named Nia Akimbo to produce a poem for the site that would commemorate it. And here you can actually see my mother looking at that poem, so you can see where the surface of that poem is. This is a poem my mother wrote for the site, and she's kind of looking at her own poem here. But you can see on each of the columns going down, there is poetry. Now, Nia Akimbo, the main poet for the site, she went into the Dallas public school system, and this represents the future to me. This is the future. I didn't want to sculpt a little child or something. So I actually had a poetry contest in the Dallas school system where Nia Akimbo went there, and she gave talks and seminars and workshops on writing poetry for the children. And there was a poetry contest where 10 of their poems were chosen to then be put on plaques and then be put on the site. The high school age children did 16-line poems like you see here that were put on 5 of the columns. And the elementary school children did like haikus, 4-line poems dealing with the site, and they were put on the 5 of the other columns. So as you walk through the whole of Freedmen's Memorial, you can also meditate on the poetry that was written by adults and children and give you the insight of the site from all different age groups of people that interacted with it. The thing that makes me the most proud now, I wanted to make a living monument that is also for our dead ancestors, right? I wanted it to be a place where people could have events. So just recently, in May of 2020, when there was vigils and a lot of things going on, events surrounding the death of George Floyd, In Dallas, Freedmen's Memorial was chosen to have vigils dealing with that specific subject matter. And I was extremely proud that my monument was used for that. I really knew that it was being used for an important reason that I had gone about my original design. So I was very proud of that. This was also a time when many sculptures were being taken down. And to see mine used for a very positive thing, dealing with the subject matter, was very, very emotional moment. So this is just showing, you know, other parts of the event that were happening at the time. And that the people would gather, see that as a gathering site during times of trouble, right? That meant a lot to me that it would be used in that way. This is my original little architectural model. When I was competing to get this project, you can see my original idea pretty much is encompassing everything that you saw in the finished project. So I was very grateful. I was extremely blessed that the city of Dallas went as close as they could to my original presentation to them of my idea during the competitive stage of it. They didn't have to do that, but it must have touched people to the point where they really wanted to see it realized. So that was this is my legacy of my whole career. So I'm very proud of it. And thank you very much. I appreciate your time and patience. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. Very much appreciate your comments. So Mario, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn myself off, but Mario, you're up next.
Can you hear me okay?
Indeed, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I consider it a great honor. I worked on the Contraband Freedman Memorial for Alexandria, Virginia, with the main feature sculpture. That truly was a huge honor. But I think besides being an honor, it was also a tremendous enlightenment about what actually took place there. If we could put up the...
There we go.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. So this is I called it the Path of Thorns and Roses from all of the history I read there. I was very fortunate enough to get access to handwritten manuscripts of the refugees who made their way to Alexandria and were able to talk about what took place. And why is that not working? Hang on one second. There we go. This, of course, is the sculpture, but I got my hands on the manuscripts and I was shocked at some of the things I was reading. I mean, I feel like it really opened the door that our history books are not telling the full story, and it makes one wonder why things are not healed yet. And I feel like as I read through it, it buried the stories, no pun intended, of what took place of the refugees who made their way to Alexandria, but then to have their actual burial site literally vanish from existence right next door to a white cemetery, and only to be uncovered many, many decades later. It was an eye-opener. When I started the project, of course, I had to make a model. That was the original model. And I was asked to be a finalist among, I don't remember how many artists were asked. And I felt so strong about the project that I kind of went crazy on the model, and I created like a 9-foot model. And that was quite an ordeal, shipping it to Alexandria, because I told myself, even if I don't get the project, this is something I want to create anyway and tell this history. And there were 5 components that the committee had asked us to convey through our art. It was oppression, struggle, sacrifice, compassion, and hope. So I had to convey these into the figurative sculpture. I also want to say that in a lot of my monuments and larger sculptures on social justice, I try to incorporate the form of a helix. And in this case, you can kind of see the helix forming, and I do all my sculpture on the helix. And the helix represents two things. It represents a very hard and difficult, windy road up, but it is also the symbol of us as human beings, that we are more alike than not alike. And that's reflective in just about all of my monuments. This is during the sculpting process. That is the figure of sacrifice. During reading the manuscripts, there were over 40% of the children died in that history of basically, they thought Alexandria was going to be a free city, and it was anything but a free city, because when they got there, so many of them were put into these barracks encampments. And from the manuscripts that I read, there was intentionally put there, whether they were sick or not, hoping that they would get sick and possibly die. And some of the descriptions, as you can see in the sculpture at this stage, was that they were either naked or just had rags that they were wearing, which, by the way, was kind of a point I had to argue, because I felt we needed to tell the truth here. Some people were put off by that. I felt the truth needed to be told. This is the figure of oppression. This was the full-size sculpt, which I did separate. I did each figure separate. So if this figure were to stand up, he'd be about 9 feet tall. But this is from trying to convey that feeling of being oppressed, and the horror of slavery, and the pain and the agony of it. This is the figure of struggle, and the struggle is not only struggling through the pain of slavery, but trying to go above and beyond slavery. This is the sculpted figure of compassion, who's holding a baby, which is the future, kind of symbolic of the future. And in the manuscripts, I had read that it was the women mostly who aided and helped people getting through that horrible, horrible time, even though so many people had passed away. This is a close-up of compassion. This is when I was working on the face. This is the figure of hope, and he is the very top figure, and he's on his tippy toes, and on the helix, it's with winding thorns and roses, and he's holding an unbloomed rose, and the unbloomed rose is the hope of the hope of freedom. And in my opinion, in reading all the manuscripts, even though they came there thinking it was going to be free for them, it was anything but free. So that's why I have it as an unbloomed rose. And the tippy toes, of course, are the thorns that he's having to stand around and avoid. This was the bronzing process when we were welding up the figures, give you an idea. This is also during the bronzing. The final bronze is about 32 feet tall. This is a close-up of oppression and struggle next to each other. That's the figure of compassion in the final version. This is the figure of struggle. I felt it was important to really have the feeling of physically, what would you feel like if you were going through this horrible process? And that's why he has this kind of helter-skelter kind of pose in agony. This, of course, is the final version of the figure of hope. And there's a circle of thorns around him that he's trying to pass through that barrier, which is figuratively trying to pass through slavery. This was during the dedication. I was deeply touched, and in fact, it had me pretty choked up. There was a huge procession line of the living ancestors of the refugees. And this line was like a mile long of people, and everyone brought a long stem rose and they put it at the feet of the memorial. And the rose, of course, is the symbol that we used here as freedom. Here's some of the replicas of the tombstones. As I said, over 40% of the graves were children. I think what was so sad and I felt needs to be in our educational system is what actually happened there. That not only had this horrible, difficult journey, but there was this very high rate of death once they got there. And then to actually cover up the cemetery was like a triple whammy. But I guess they say the truth always comes through. And in the mid-50s, there was a gas station made on top of the site. I guess people thought it didn't matter or they wanted to forget it. But then a couple decades later, 3 decades later, baby coffin graves started to come up, and there had to be a lot of explaining about that. Fortunately, people did come and support this and allowed it to be restored and make it the site that it is. And that is kind of a long shot of the sculpture monument, and kind of a open crypt area that has the information, the names. It has more bas-reliefs of the story of the actual refugees coming. You can kind of see in the foreground, those are markers of the graves. Those are children's graves, by the way. And that's it. That was the day of inauguration. And that is pretty much it on my presentation. Get out of that. Oh.
Thank you, Mario, very much. So we will move to the final presentation by Jerome. And keep in mind to the audience that you can put questions into the Q&A, and I will take those as we open up. And I have my own questions as well. So Mario, please go ahead. Jerome, please go ahead. Sorry about that. Mario already went. Jerome, please go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure. It looks like we're all going to have some degree of technical difficulty here. Hold on. Okay, public art in commemoration. I'm very pleased to, honored to have been included in this panel and have the opportunity to present the project I did in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. As was mentioned, the Portsmouth African Burying Ground Memorial. This is an aerial view of the finished memorial. It occupies Chestnut Street between State and Court. And I was pleased with the opportunity to not only create the artwork for this memorial, but also site layout and the overall immersion experience. This is what Chestnut looked like up until 2003, when utility workers digging a hole to correct a utility line came upon coffins laying across a bright blue sewer line, which means that at the point that that sewer line was put in, The workers realized that there was a cemetery there and basically looked at the clock, said, you know, we're done for the day, let's cover it up. Uh, so that represents the lowest area, the lowest um, portion of our character as human beings. Fortunately, in 2003, what ended up happening when they were repairing this sewer line, our higher angels took over, and it was determined that we needed to do right by these 200 plus souls that were projected to have been interred there. So 13 were in the area that they were excavating for the sewer line, and they removed some of them for archaeological purposes. It was also decided at that point that something of a sufficient character and nature needed to be created to honor these souls and to try to erase the disrespect and the injustice that had been imposed upon these souls for all this length of time. So I was fortunate enough to have been selected to be the designer artist for the Portsmouth African Burying Ground, I'm sorry. So I decided that there should be a sense of journey. And so the entryway to this piece is composed of a granite slab, 9 feet tall, 4 feet wide by approximately 9 inches wide. And on one side of that slab stands representation of the first African brought into Portsmouth in 1645. There was quite an experience in creating this rendering, because quite frankly, the more I thought about what this individual and all of those since have experienced was anger, quite frankly. There was a great sense of anger. But I knew that anger was not a way to move forward, either for him or for me as the artist. And so I wanted to make sure that anger was replaced with a sense of dignity. And so he's standing to the edge of that wall, and he's reaching around it to Mother Africa, who's on the opposite side of that wall. And the idea is that these hands, the closeness of these hands, the articulations of these hands represent the tragedy of separation from family, home, country, culture, all that you knew. What was making me so angry about this experience is this individual, one of the fortunate ones, I guess, and that sounds rather ironic to say, who made it across the Middle Passage, shows up on landscape, shows up in an area where all of a sudden it gets frightfully cold and white snowflakes start falling from the sky. In other words, he's confronted with something that is otherworldly. It's something well beyond anything that he could possibly have imagined. And his existence there is as an enslaved person. So she represents Mother Africa, the country, the culture, the life way that he had been removed from. One of the interesting things that has happened with this memorial is that dedicated in 2015, every day since then, the mother figure has flowers in her hands. It's not clear who's doing this or how many people are involved in this, but it has become this very poignant, simple but forceful ritual. And so he's gazing to his right, which is in effect looking down into the memorial. And that rose-colored band that you see along the paving is inscribed with text from a petition that came forth in 1779, signed onto by 20 enslaved people, basically petitioning for their freedom and the abolition of slavery. As you can imagine, it was ignored, but it just indicated the fact that these individuals maintain self-pride, they maintain self-worth, And they wanted to try to do something to eradicate that negative condition. Along that petition line, there's also this information marker, a sculptured form to provide some contextual information for your experience within the memorial. And that petition line ends as if going underneath this plaza, which is at the lower end of the memorial. And that is a Sankofa symbol that you're looking at. If you're not familiar, it's an Adinkra symbol depicting different ways of looking at life, ways of existing within society. In this case, Sankofa means go back and fetch it. And that Sankofa is on a seal that permanently covers the vault that I designed into this plaza for the reinterment of those individuals that were exhumed for archaeological purpose. In that same plaza is the seat of remembrance, that granite stone, and it's surrounded by these 8 community figures. They're designed to represent the diversity of the community in terms of age. They're faceless so that you can see yourself amongst them. And they are they're cast concrete with bronze plates attached to the front and the back. And on that bronze plate are lines from my poem that I wrote for the purpose of this memorial. These lines are, this text is actually etched into the surface, and it enables visitors to take a sheet of paper, lay it across that text, and walk away with a rubbing of their experience there at the memorial. In this case, I stand for those who survived upon these shores. For civil purposes, since this plaza was elevated, there needed to be a railing. And I took advantage of the opportunity to design a railing rather than put in something standard. And that design is based upon paddles and kente cloth patterns. That also provided an opportunity to bring in future generations. So I held hands-on workshops at a local nearby middle school. And they created these tiles, which were derived from kente cloth patterns and or Adinkra symbols as well. So as others have said, I'm delighted that this memorial, this plaza, has become a gathering place. And a gathering place for a diversity of both citizens of Portsmouth as well as tourists who come to town and are advised to go by and spend some time at the memorial. It's also become a site of ritualistic performances, basically honoring the ancestors and keeping their dignity and their presence alive and amongst us. Particularly important in light of what's going on in our society today. And so the remains that were removed were reinterred in cases, wooden cases that were handcrafted by a local woodworker. And there was a ceremony to replace these cases into this vault. As you can see, community members offered flowers and other offerings to pay their respect. A local African priest administered to the ceremony to further relate the contemporary setting and the geological setting of Portsmouth with Mother Africa, the homeland that these individuals had been stolen from. And the dedication was attended by more than 500 people. It was quite a gathering, which started actually with a marching, a caisson marching, bringing those cases from a nearby church where they had been blessed overnight to the site and placed into the vault, and then sealed, permanently placed to cover it and protect it. And this is the poem. If I may leave it up for a while for you to have a chance to read it. And it ends with, I stand for those who pay homage to this ground. I stand for those who find dignity in these bones. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to conversation.
So thank you, the three of you, very much for your presentations. And for the audience, I see we have 2 questions. I have a couple questions that I'll start with, and then I'll get to the questions. But if you have questions from the participants, please enter it into the Q&A, and then I will go through the questions and ask. But so I'm going to, and in some ways, scratch the questions I sent you, because your projects raise some really interesting things. And one of the big things that I see across the 3 of your memorial designs and your consideration for the site is this use of symbolic language and symbolic form. And I'm really interested in how you're using that symbolic language and what it is that you expect a visitor to fully be able to unpack. For example, David, to understand what each of those figures might be, which is why you now have your YouTube tour to help you. But also, Mario, you have this idea that the city wanted these 5 categories of oppression, sacrifice, compassion, and then Jerome as well with the symbolic language. So if you want that really came through for me in listening to you.
Yes, for me, the symbolism was, well, art is symbolism by its nature, but I also wanted my site to be a place, if you were going to explain to people, or like a child, your child, what slavery was about, I wanted you to be able to use the site to go from figure to figure. Even the title of each figure is kind of telling you part of what they represent. And as you tell your child a history of slavery and enslavement and emancipation, you could kind of walk them in front of the different symbolisms, the symbol of the sculptures, and go through the site and as a teaching tool to expose a child or a young adult to that whole history of slavery. I also wanted it to be a site that could be used in that way also.
I think for me, and David, I love your work, and same with you, Jerome. I think for me, what's important is the viewer understand the significance and importance of what took place here. And I come back to the fact that so much of this history was buried and tried to be forgotten. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you look at the extremism that they had to go through, the symbolism is really important and kind of like a guide for me anyway, the 5 different symbols that I had to deal with. It is a great way to uncover a very difficult story to tell about if you're saying it truthfully. And I think as artists, we are always fighting against having to tell the truth, or fighting for telling the truth rather. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important.
Yeah, I think that, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
I think that it's important to understand that the very nature of being an artist is being a symbologist. And being a sculptor is being a symbologist in the round. And so what do symbols do? They basically take ideas, they take elements and they transform them into something that hopefully will imbue them with greater meaning. What I like to do as a sculptor, particularly in my public artworks, is to provide a range of symbolism. Okay, so you start with the entry piece, which are the two figures. They're very representational, lifelike. But by the time you end up at the plaza, you've got these stylized forms, which can become more open to interpretation. They're figurative, but they're open to interpretation of, is that representation of me or somebody that I know, a community member, et cetera. And then the Sankofa, which is a symbol, it's an African symbol. So that's the objective of that is to take it back to the motherland as well. So I like to seed my memorials, my projects with as many different symbols as possible.
And so is the expectation then that the visitor, the mourner, the family member, in the case of Mario and I assume, and David, there are actually descendants who can still come to these sites. What then is that role of mourning in those at these three sites? For the individuals, I guess there's this symbolic language that you're using, and then there's kind of a tourist visitor that might come to your site, but there's actually family members who are coming here as sites where their family members have been recovered. I mean, Mario, their names are listed in that antechamber that sits to the side of your major monument. There's 5,000 bodies. We know that they are gone. And Jerome, we can see the remains, right? How does that work out, that tension between the symbolic language that you're trying to use and the very real experience of being at a site for mourning by an individual? Am I making sense or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, in my case, that's why I wanted to use words and images, because the main poem called Here deals with the people that have died there and are buried there. And the poem my mother made also dealt with the actual people that were buried there, and their history and speaking to their ancestors and to the people that came, people that are there now that know they have ancestors there. I believe that the poetry is something that they could interact with along with the actual visual images of what their ancestors would have gone through to actually be in the cemetery. Yes.
I think whether it's poetry or art or sculpture, and of course, as we are all sculptors, there is a realness with sculpture. You can touch it and you can feel it in the roundness. And I know for myself, I used live models, but I think for the ancestors to see that now, to see these artworks now, it's not just looking at art. It's, my God, what did these people go through that allows me to live now? I mean, and the people who helped these people to continue the life. And it's, that's a difficult thing for some people to grasp unless they can have something real to look at and feel. And that's kind of why this is so important. And I love all kinds of art, but and I love poetry. And in fact, Maya Angelou was on my board for my Remember Them project. And it's a art, but there is something also about the three-dimensional that is so significant, that is everlasting.
Well, and if I may add a little bit to that, it's about fostering or compelling or inspiring conversation. Okay, the symbols go to a certain point of touching individuals, but you mentioned some of these individuals are related to those who were buried there. Some are simply tourists who are passing through. You have no way of discerning specifically who these visitors will be. So the idea is to provide symbols that will hopefully compels some degree of an emotional reaction, an intellectual reaction, and then as a site, as a place, ideally that would then foster communication between people, and that's where the symbolism begins to flourish and becomes more profound through communication, through dialogue.
I'm often confronted with, because I've done several monuments around the country on the theme of social justice, and I'm often confronted with extremes. And one extreme I'm confronted with is, why do we need to do this? And most of the people who say it like that have no clue of what took place in this history. And I feel like if they see that, we can start healing. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but this comes back to our educational system, that for the growing up of public education, I know I didn't read or get to see these stories. It was basically names and dates. There were some things that I heard, of course, about Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, but these actual living stories of people now, and I feel like we have to bring them forward and have to show the truth with symbols like these so that people get it. And I think it will bring people together, not apart from each other. So I think that's a really important thing in all the artwork that the three of us are doing, and others, artists and sculptors.
Well, it's interesting, if I might add, prior to going on, we were talking about the prevailing attitude that slavery was a Southern thing. But my project in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brought forth something that, as I would talk to people that grew up in Portsmouth, they had no idea, okay, that slavery was as prominent, as prevalent as it was. So even within that community, and I was concerned about, is there going to be pushback about this? You know, we don't want to think of ourselves that way. But instead, there was across the board a real desire to have this truth become known. So I'm agreeing with you, Mario. I think that it's important that we do what we do, even though there's a lot of effort that has been placed into making sure these stories don't get told, but they need to. And I can't think of one of the most effective ways of doing it is public art.
So this leads me actually to my next question, and then I'm going to attend to some of the questions in the Q&A. And this is a question that I'm really wrestling at large in my project, but it is about representing the Black body through figural sculpture. And there has been a long tradition within academic sculpture, and I'm talking all the way back to the 18th century, of kind of a stereotype or a denigration of the Black body, right, in public sculpture. I mean, the European tradition has created kind of a typology, and particularly of the sleeping Africa is one, for example. But I wonder so that's one issue, is around like the historic treatment that we see within a sculpture of the Black body, but also like the very real politics that we're facing now in the 21st century, in 2021, around the trial of this police officer who murdered George Floyd, and that representation of his suffering that we see over and over again. And so what does it mean to also show that kind of suffering in three-dimensional form? And particularly, Mario, your work does that. Like, you really, particularly with those image of the oppression and the kind of anguish that is embedded in your monument. But I think, David, that's certainly true with you as well. So I guess the question is, why figuration? I think this is a question that someone has asked as well, that you're not using abstraction, but that you've really gone towards this very direct kind of vocabulary through the body.
I think for me, if I could be so bold to say this, I feel like public art in particular, I know for a huge number of projects I've had to deal with, wants to bury the truth, does not want to reveal the truth. And that doesn't heal. I keep coming back to that. And that's why it is so important, I feel, to try to, number one, understand the history. Number two, put yourself as well as you can into that person's body and mind and understand it so that you can capture those very important moments and very difficult moments to view. Because I also feel like we live in a day and age, there's some magnificent things with technology. I want to preface that. But it also, I have watched a generation look at history and artwork in 2 seconds and it's gone. And they move on to something else. You need to capture an audience, and doing the figurative sculpture as emotional as possible of what we are really feeling. I mean, we're all emotional creatures. Maybe artists were sometimes more emotional, but having that captured sets up the situation for discussion, for understanding, for even debate, but it brings us to the truth. And anything less than that, I think we're just beating around the bush. And that's why, at least when it comes to history telling, social justice, artwork, and monuments, why not tell the truth? Why should we hold back? That's how I feel.
I know for me, an important part of me doing monuments at all was because even as a small child, I saw how African Americans were portrayed in big monuments. Overwhelmingly, even if the sculptor or the people that commissioned it were very sympathetic to the enslaved Africans, they always had them on their knees in some kind of way of supplication. Josiah Wedgwood did a very important piece for the people that were seeking, emancipation. But the person was on their knees with their hands up in prayer, right? And then the famous one that is under discussion or debate now with Abraham Lincoln standing up with his hand over the African American on his knees, right? So I grew up with these, and then when I started doing sculpture, one of the main reasons I wanted to do public monuments is because I wanted to show, African people and African Americans in a more dignified way for our time, right? The other sculptors were men of their time, and they were very sympathetic to African Americans in that time period, and they dealt with it the only way they knew how. But now we're in a modern time, and now we have Black sculptors that can be sculptors, and we can portray ourselves, right? And how we view ourselves. So it was important for me to make a large part of my career about making monuments of African American people by an African American sculptor that has experienced some of these things. Definitely my parents have and grandparents have, and they've taught me about what they've experienced, so I can put that into my work now. And the human body has a language of its own, right? We all have body language. We can communicate without words just by our facial expressions, the poses we go into. So I try to make that an important part of my communication, right? Using the body, using the Black body when I'm dealing with that subject matter, to try to show pride, to show, other things, dignity, just in the pose. So that was an important part of me becoming a sculptor of public monuments to begin with. Yes.
Thank you for that. Do you have any, Jerome, because it feels like you are, that idea of dignity and pride, but Jerome, it feels like you do both, because I've seen some of your other work that's abstract, really. And that, so you seem to be moving between figuration and abstraction in your work.
Well, I think that's a function of wanting to marry what I do with respect to cultural identity, political commentary with who I am as an artist,
Mm.
how artistic imagery, abstract, color, form, shape, uh, also creates dialogue. So again, with the Portsmouth Memorial, I make it a point to say that, yeah, I want to depict that first enslaved person coming into Portsmouth. And the more I thought about him, the more pissed I got. But I realized that anger was not something that he should be conveying, because anger basically short-circuited his sense of dignity and pride. And it was dignity and pride that has enabled us as a people to make it through this as far as we have. But then at the other end of that side are these stylized forms. They're humanoid. They have no faces, but they have a sense of personality. So there is an instance in which the language, the iconography of art is being utilized to fuel the conversation as well. And if I may say, it's also a matter of the journey, the physical journey of walking from one of those elements, iconographic elements, to the other, the space that you're walking through. The nature of the space is as much a part of this dialogue as anything else. So, I like to think of it as a comprehensive package. As a sculptor, it's challenging to be orchestrating all of that. But in the end, I think the visitor, the person who's experiencing the site, walks away with that much more.
And I think that I'm so glad you mentioned the nature of space, because I would argue that both David and Mario, it's also about the comprehensive space. There's the monument, but then the spatial relationships are really significant to the works as well. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions. Jerome, it looks like you're up with two. So I will just start. First is from, but also I think they want to ask the other two artists present as well to jump in. But Kaylee Alexander asked, I was really struck by Jerome's mention of the anonymous ritual of leaving flowers at the Portsmouth Memorial. Really powerful, actually, that someone's doing that daily. And she's wondering if the other panelists have noticed similar ritualized acts of remembrance with the other monuments we've discussed today. Could you all maybe talk a little bit more about perhaps unanticipated interactions or even organic rituals that have formed around these monuments?
Well, I guess I'll jump in there first. The way that Mother Africa's hand crosses her abdomen, I left a little space between the forefinger and the thumb, thinking that people might want to take hold of that, that kind of gesture.
Okay.
So I was anticipating some degree of interaction, but what has happened is even more poignant, powerful, and overwhelming, in that space is used to contain flowers. And again, unless someone has come forth and said, I'm the person who's doing this, last count that I got, it still remains unknown who's been placing those flowers there daily.
I think for me, I get on a regular basis imagery, video, photos of people who place the long stem roses at the Path of Thorns and Roses in sculpture in Alexandria. And I'm deeply touched by that. And it's, we unveiled that, it's been over 5 years. And people are just doing that on a regular basis. And it seems the flowers seem to be this like common denominator at these memorials.
Mario, I can just say there's always flowers at the memorial in Alexandria. I go there often, and there's always something left at the foot of the statue. I don't think there's Christmas wreaths, there are flowers, there are roses. There's never been a time that I've visited that site where someone has not actively left this kind of memory device there, the flower, as an acknowledgement of the deceased.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
That's similar to Freedman's Memorial too. A lot of times there are, maybe not every day, but there are a lot of people that leave flowers and even wreaths sometimes at the site, but the site is used a lot for rituals. There are people that come out, and there are people that have religious rituals there that are more African centered rituals, where they'll have music, and they'll have certain dances around the central figure group, and they'll have events there. And that's very gratifying to when I see it. So that's something that has kind of taken on a more normal use of the site. And you can see a lot of those online sometimes, because they'll put it up, the rituals they had there and the events they've had there. But obviously the most powerful one was just, to me, was just recently dealing with the George Floyd incident. Yes.
So I'll make real quickly, Renee, I really appreciate your term memory device, because ultimately that's what we're all creating. Every aspect of these memorials are memory devices. So I think that's a very poignant term that you just put out there.
Well, and I think, Kaylee's question about are there other unanticipated interactions, I think sometimes it's hard to know because we're not in those spaces all the time, right? But there's a way, and I speak about Alexandria because I live very close by, that I've also stood in that space and seen family members come and they're touching the name. So there's a haptic interaction with the monument that's really important too. This idea of touch, and that one can engage it. And also, as David says, this idea that it becomes the locus of a Black Lives Matter protest, right? About current day issues, that the monument's not just about the past, but about our very real present and future in that space as well. Christina DeKira asked, well, actually it's a comment, but it's to Jerome. It says, the hands reaching towards each other feels like present day people reaching towards ancestors who were buried there. It feels like it could symbolize so many dynamics of reaching back to those who came before. They even evoke the way public art sculptures reaches into the past and future, creating something to honor the past that will last for generations to come. Those hands are so powerful and memorable. So just so you know, I just want to give you that little.
So much.
And then Emily Bloomfield actually asked, so many memorials use abstraction to make the stories feel more comfortable. I admire all of these works for the directness in which they address the important subject matter. I'd be curious to understand from any of the sculptors if the approval process was challenging. Good question, right? So you have to go through these art commissions or a city council, or in the case of Virginia, through community groups that get a vote on the monument. So did you run into any problems in relationship to that?
How much time do we have?
Okay.
Actually, the Alexandria Monument that I did, surprisingly, I didn't get very much flack or backlash about the original model that I did. Some of the figures were practically nude, as I read in the manuscripts. Mm-hmm. They said you could show certain exposure, but you got to put a little bit more on the female figures. So I did that, but that was about it. And then, of course, there were some that were fully clothed because that's how they were. But Alexandria, Virginia was really quite good about allowing me to do my original presentation. They really didn't change anything, which is rare.
Right. Well, I know I kind of anticipated, obviously, art is also about good and bad taste, right? So when you present something that is actually tragic or very emotional with powerful, some people would say negative emotions, you have to deal with those hard subjects in good taste. That's what we do, right? So I really made a point of that. It's like I showed the brutality of slavery through the marks on the person's back, but I did it in a way I feel was in good taste. You knew there was brutality there, but I did it in a way people knew that was happening, but it wasn't traumatic to the viewer, but it still got it across. So, I think that's, part of our job as an artist to deal with very hard, traumatic subjects, but in a way that doesn't trigger people, to use a term now, but still gets the point across. This is a hard, tragic issue, but you try to do it in as good a taste as you can.
Well, I can divulge a little bit of the process in responding to this question. And it sounds like all of us have, as artists, as sculptors, have competed for projects. And that process is, you may have 3 months or 6 weeks, whatever the length of time is, to put together a proposal. You know that there are other proposals coming, so it's a dynamic, a mental dynamic that's pretty intense. But I think it's also limited because I say this because the project in Portsmouth took a different approach. They interviewed the 3 finalists and determined a selection based solely on those interviews, which meant that I then was able to come under contract and had an extended period of time to develop a design. That development of the design put me as a team member with stakeholders. So we were able to converse and talk about and get to know each other, so that the approval process was one in which we were basically saying, yeah, we all have come up with this idea, or we are all in support of this idea. And one shining example of that, which goes to the comments about the hands, I'm working on these life-size figures in my studio. And one day the hands are touching. The next day, the hands are farther apart. The next day, they're like halfway in between. And I was going back and forth and not clear in my own mind how close those hands should be. So I took it to the steering committee, and they unanimously, automatically said they should be this far apart. And that's where they are. So it was just a beautiful example of having the opportunity to develop a relationship with the people who would be making approval, and then being able to bring them into the process in areas that I was having difficulty making decisions about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, Jerome, it says, "Hi, Pop Jerome. This is Phoenix Meadows, Phoenix Meadows," and it says, "How long did it take to make the sculptures at Portsmouth?" Mr. Newton said it took you, or you started the process 8 years. Was that right?
Well,
I started in 95 and it went to 2004.
Yeah. So how long, Jerome, to actually?
The rendering of the figures was about 9 months, a 9-month process. The casting and the plating of the 8 community figures was maybe another 3 months. And my studio is set up that, with the exception of final bronze casting, I do all of the work myself. I'm a design build facility.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have the potential to cast at your design build site?
I don't have the capacity to cast life-size figures.
Okay. Okay.
I'm working with the foundry outside of Atlanta, and they send a technician to come and make the rubber mold. And that goes through the process in the foundry. But everything else is done in my studio. Yeah.
And Jerome, this is another question, and then we have a general one about education. But Jerome is from Jordan Meadows, and it says you're a resident of Georgia, correct? Which you are. But it says, what is your opinion of the removal of memorials? This could be something for all of you, specifically statues of Civil War figures. Like, what do you all feel about this removal? I mean, this could be a whole nother panel, but if you could give a brief answer, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that's my son for me.
Okay.
That's a very good question. And I know it's off topic somewhat, but I'm currently creating a memorial to Mr. Ed Johnson in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was an African-American male who was unfairly convicted and lynched of raping a white woman. 2 Black lawyers came to his defense, took it to the Supreme Court, which was precedent setting, but the mob overtook everything and lynched Ed Johnson from the Walnut Street Bridge. So there's parallels there with George Floyd and what's going on contemporaneously. So my view on that is that, and I'll try to be brief, the call to take down Confederate monuments underscores the society's awareness of how powerful monuments are. That's why they were put up in the first place. Okay. But I'm less concerned about focusing my energy as an artist on taking down monuments and more concerned about creating monuments with all of their implied power for the stories like Ed Johnson, the stories like George Floyd. But I will say this, and I don't know if it's going to be controversial or not. um, it pains me, and I'll say it, it pains me to see the desecration of these monuments. I think it's better served to simply take them down and remove them. And I say that because Ed Johnson is about mob mentality. And I would hate to think that at some point, some mob mentality would decide that my monument to Ed Johnson is offensive and feel that they have the right to desecrate it.
Mm.
I know.
That may be a longer conversation that we have to do.
Yeah.
Well, I actually wrote an article for the Dallas Morning News about this subject. So my name in Dallas Morning News, you can read that article. But the premise of it was every community has to make those decisions for themselves. And I believe in through the political process. I don't believe in any vandalism of any monument. I believe that the community through their process should debate it and then decide should they keep it up or take it down in a dignified way. It can go to another site where it can be seen more in the context of the history that created it in the first place. But I also believe this, public monuments that are allowed to remain in a community reflect on what that community sees as important and how they want to be seen by other people, right? So if you have a Confederate monument that's still up, that reflects on that whole city that is keeping that monument up, that represents them, right? So it should not be, even a Confederate monument, I don't think anything should be vandalized. I think it should be a community decision. Some will come to the decision to keep it up. Some will come to the decision to take it down, right? But they have to know that the monuments that are up represent them as a community. Right? So that's the way I look at that.
I agree with David and Jerome with what they're saying, but I'd like to add that yes, they're a reflection of the communities, and there should be some process that puts them in their perspective, because I feel like how else can you learn? There's so much to learn from what these monuments are, whether you like them or not, and to see the context they were made. If we can somehow create, either they go to a different museum or the local community says, this is what we want to do, but let's put it into its perspective. But to vandalize anything makes you as bad as the people you were vandalizing, in my opinion. And that's not a good thing. We have to, I think we need to be above that now. We need to learn, and you don't learn by destroying. That's all I can say.
And I would say as the non-sculptor that I believe in monument removal of some monuments, but also I think that we saw real anger this summer at the absolute staticness of our relationship with these monuments and the inability to move beyond this Confederate monument, and why are they still showing up, and that mapped onto the violence that we're seeing directed to Black and brown people. People were very angry, and it's interesting to me that the side effect is vandalism, because there's no, I think, how does one release that kind of emotional, right, anger at a system, right, that has really, at a racist system that has been perpetuated through the public landscape in some really real ways. So, but I hear you all about that idea of having communities actually make the decision in a thoughtful way, as David, you're kind of outlining, is important that we can have, and that actually can lead to other kinds of conversations, right? If we can sit down and kind of have a conversation about what is the problem with this monument, why might it be problematic to face a Confederate monument day in and day out in one's community, and what messages they're sending. So I'd like to wrap up with one last question, and then Ann Coles, I actually will respond to you directly or have the artist respond to you as well, but because we're down to 2 minutes. But this is a question from Thomas Canavan that's really about education and the educational work that these monuments can do and the interaction that you have with local schools. So he asks, have the K-12 schools created or worked with these artists to help students and communities understand their work and significance? So did you do, like David, you talked about the poetry and the very active engagement with students around slavery. Jerome, with you as well. And Mario, I'm not sure what happened in Alexandria, but if you could address the Thomas Canavan, that would be great. Question.
You want me to go first?
Sure, Mario, go for it. Go for
okay.
it. Yeah.
On all my major projects, I have interns involved. And when the Alexandria Monument was being built, I was also finishing the Remember Them Monument. And we had a total of 65 interns at that time. And the intent is to not only give creative means to these students and inspire them, but to educate them on history. And we have new projects coming up here that I've always continued that process of interns, especially reaching out to students in communities who normally don't have access to this.
Mm.
So that's what we do on our side.
Okay.
I try to give art, the ability to do art.
Mm-hmm.
I know with Freedman's Memorial, there are definitely city tours that go there on a regular basis, showing major elements of Dallas. There are family tours that are taken there. So the city is starting to look at it as a way of educating people on the history of Dallas, which I'm very happy about. And again, from the beginning, I wanted children involved as a symbol of the future. Rather than sculpting a child, I wanted children to be active on the site. Mm-hmm. So I wanted the poetry from the beginning, and I wanted that to be like an educational component of it. Mm-hmm. From the beginning. I didn't know how that was going to happen, and I didn't know that the poet I worked with she took it on herself, and she really went in and did the interaction with the students in the school and teaching them how to write the poems and things like that. So that's very important to me that happened. And there are now, you'll see some school tours where there are children there going through the site. So it is starting to be used for that also.
Okay.
And with Portsmouth, the educational component really was comprised of two objectives. One was to first and foremost make students aware of the fact that this history existed. As I mentioned earlier, people who have grown up, adults in Portsmouth, had no idea. So it was great to be able to present this historical awareness to the students. But beyond that, it was also to introduce them to the cultural legacy and the cultural identity that these enslaved people came from. Hence dealing with kente cloth and Adinkra symbols, and taking that as an opportunity to say, these were human beings first and foremost, but they were also people who had a culture, they had art, they had a way of living. So it was designed to serve on both of those levels. And then finally, the school is maybe 5 or 6 blocks away from the memorial. And so these students walk past it twice a day. And they're just quite excited to see their work permanently incorporated into the setting.
So thank you so much, David, Mario, and Jerome. I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with me. I think we could continue this conversation because I have many more questions to ask the three of you, which I will do and continue to engage you. But thank you very much for attending this webinar today to the participants. And we are done. It's 5:33, so we need to wrap it up. But thank you really for talking about your work in this. And one thing that I did want to say that's really significant about these three three sites. These are all, which you mentioned, but I want to make this very clear, were all desecrated cemeteries in which archaeologists worked to recover the remains. And then there's this kind of art effort to memorialize. And so archaeology and art kind of working hand in hand in this historical moment was really important. So thank you and be well. See you all.
You. True pleasure.